The air was warm, heavy with the smell of pine and sunscreen, the kind of day where time seemed to stretch lazily across the shimmering water. The lake was busy but calm. A handful of families gathered along the sandy edge, older kids paddling on inflatable rafts, smaller ones splashing in the shallows. 8-year-old Ethan Cole was everywhere at once, darting between the blanket his parents had spread out under a birch tree and the weathered wooden dock that jutted out into the water. His bright red life jacket stood out against the deep blues and greens of the scene, bobbing up and down as he ran, laughing in that unself-conscious way only children can. His parents, Paul and Linda, were unpacking sandwiches and juice boxes, chatting idly with another couple they had met at the campground earlier that week. They weren't worried. Ethan was strong in the water, and the lake was shallow near the shore. Still, Linda's eyes followed him out of habit. Catching glimpses of his small figure weaving in and out of sight, she heard him laugh once more, sharp and clear across the water, and then nothing. It wasn't the kind of nothing that follows a moment of fun, where the sound simply fades into another. It was abrupt. The dock was empty. Linda's gaze swept over the rippling surface, expecting to see him bob up from under the dock or emerge from behind one of the posts, but the space remained vacant. Her breath caught. She stood, scanning quickly toward the trees behind them, then back toward the water. No, Ethan. At first she told herself it was fine. Maybe he had gone to show a frog he'd caught to one of the other kids, or had wandered up toward the campground showers. But as the seconds passed and her calls went unanswered, the calm of the summer afternoon cracked. Paul dropped the mustard jar he was holding and began moving quickly toward the dock, his eyes darting along the shoreline. A low murmur spread among nearby families as they noticed the sudden urgency. People stopped what they were doing, turning toward the dock, scanning the lake themselves. Linda shouted his name again, louder this time, her voice bouncing off the water. Still nothing. Paul stepped onto the dock, peering into the water below, and then without hesitation, he kicked off his shoes and dived in. A few others followed, splashing into the lake, diving under, and scanning beneath the wooden planks. Someone shouted toward the camp office for help. The camp manager appeared minutes later, clutching a radio, his face pale. Within moments, he was relaying the emergency to county dispatch, his voice clipped and precise. Possible drowning. Juvenile male, age 8, last seen wearing a red life jacket, location, West Shore Dock. The first sheriff's deputy arrived within 10 minutes, lights flashing across the gravel road leading down to the beach. Behind him, a rescue truck pulled a flat-bottomed boat on a trailer, and uniformed officers began unloading gear with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before. Divers suited up at the water's edge, pulling on thick neoprene, checking air tanks and fitting masks. Linda stood frozen, arms wrapped around herself, barely noticing the cold spray from nearby splashes. Paul was still in the water, unwilling to climb out, scanning beneath the surface as if he could will Ethan to appear. By late afternoon, the search was in full swing. Divers worked in pairs, descending into the murky depths where the sun's light faded to nothing within a few feet. They swept their arms slowly back and forth along the silty bottom, their lines tethered to a rescue boat above. Sonar equipment scanned a wider radius, mapping the contours of the lake bed. On shore, deputies questioned campers, asking if anyone had seen Ethan leave the water or walk into the forest trails. Most shook their heads. A few said they'd noticed him running toward the dock earlier, but no one saw him after that. As daylight began to wane, the search widened. Boats crisscrossed the lake and spotlights pierced the water, though visibility was almost non-existent. The lake was deceptively deep in places, with old stumps and logs hidden below, tangling in the darkness. Yet despite hours of searching, there was no sign of a child's body, no life jacket floating free, nothing. The stillness that settled over the campground was oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional burst of static from a deputy's radio. By nightfall, Ethan's parents were seated together under a blanket someone had given them, their faces pale and stunned, answering the same questions again and again. When the rescue captain finally approached, his face drawn, he told them the divers would continue at first light. For now, they had found nothing. No body, no evidence, just a void where a boy had been minutes before. The next morning came with no answers. The search resumed at dawn. divers methodically expanding their grid, but each pass ended the same way, empty-handed. By the third day, frustration began to creep into the rescue team's voices. Statistically, a drowning victim should have been found by now, especially in a contained body of water like this. But the lake offered nothing back. Not a trace. For the Coles, the lack of recovery was both a blessing and a torment. Without a body, there was no confirmation, no closure, just the unbearable question of what had happened in those silent, unobserved minutes on the dock. And in the quiet corners of their minds, another question began to grow, one they were afraid to speak aloud. If Ethan didn't drown, then where was he? The search continued with a grim persistence, the kind that settles in when hours turn to days without answers. Divers worked in rotations, their faces pale from the cold and from the knowledge that they were feeling their way through water so dark it swallowed the beam of their lights within inches. Visibility was measured in fingertips, not feet. Every descent meant pushing through thick, silty layers that clung to wetsuits and filled the creases of their gloves. They moved slowly, deliberately, sweeping the lake bed in expanding grids, their fingers brushing over broken branches, beer cans, and tangled fishing line. Each time, they surfaced, shaking their heads. Above the water, the search was no less meticulous. Boats equipped with side-scan sonar traced slow, deliberate paths across the lake's surface, mapping the contours below. The readouts showed ridges, sunken logs, and occasional debris, but nothing that resembled the shape of a small body. The rescue captain explained quietly to Ethan's parents that in most drownings, a victim is located quickly. If not, currents, decay, and buoyancy eventually bring the body to the surface within days. Here, though, there were no currents strong enough to pull him far, no deep channels for him to vanish into entirely. The absence of any sign was starting to feel unnatural. On shore, deputies canvassed every witness from that day, piecing together the boy's last known moments. But the accounts fractured under scrutiny. One man swore he saw Ethan standing on the dock minutes before the commotion started, leaning over to look into the water. A teenage camper claimed she saw him sprinting toward the trail that curved behind the picnic area. Another woman insisted she saw the red of his life jacket disappearing around the far end of the beach toward the parking lot. The times didn't align, the details blurred by distance and distraction. With no definitive sighting, the search widened. Scent dogs were brought in, handlers moving carefully along the gravel paths and into the pine forest that bordered the lake. At first, the dogs seemed to catch something, a faint trace that pulled them a few hundred yards into the woods before circling and fading into nothing. The handlers explained that scents could drift and that wind and water could scatter the trail, but the uncertainty was another blow to the already fragile hope that answers would come quickly. Each day brought the same routine, the low hum of boat engines, the clipped radio chatter, and the distant calls of Ethan's name that no one expected to be answered. And each evening ended with the same hollow result: no life jacket, no shoe, nobody. The longer the search went on without a recovery, the more the nature of the conversations began to change. Some in town quietly insisted that the lake had claimed him, that its depths were deceptive, and perhaps his body had lodged somewhere impossible to reach. Others began to voice a different theory, one that carried its own kind of horror. Maybe Ethan hadn't drowned at all. Maybe he had been taken. The sheriff's office didn't dismiss the idea. Deputies reviewed the campground's visitor log, looking for names that didn't match reservations and people who had left abruptly after the disappearance. They checked nearby highway cameras, though coverage was sparse in this rural stretch of Minnesota. Still, there was no tangible evidence of an abduction. No tire tracks, no dropped belongings, no clear witness account of a stranger with a child. Without physical proof, the theory remained speculation. For Paul and Linda Cole, the theories meant little. What they knew was that their son had been laughing and playing one moment, and the next, he was gone without a trace. The lake, once a place of family memories, had taken on a new, oppressive weight. They couldn't look at its surface without feeling as though it was holding something from them, keeping its silence out of spite. They stayed in a rented cabin near the campground for the first week, hoping against hope that each new search might bring him back. By the end of that week, their faces were drawn and pale, their eyes ringed with sleepless nights. The community, too, began to fracture under the pressure of the unknown. Some rallied around the Coles, organizing prayer vigils and meal deliveries. Others, in whispered conversations, wondered aloud if there was more to the story. If maybe Ethan had wandered off, if there was a family dispute no one knew about, or worse, if the truth was closer to home than anyone wanted to believe. By the 10th day, official search operations scaled back. Divers could not justify continuing indefinitely without leads. The sheriff assured the Coles the case was still active, that investigators would follow up on any new information, but the absence of daily search activity left a silence more unbearable than the constant hum of boats and radios. In that silence, the questions grew sharper. If Ethan had drowned, why had the lake not given him back? And if he hadn't, then somewhere out there, someone knew exactly where he was, and they had managed to take him in broad daylight from a crowded lakeside without leaving a single trace. Within weeks, the disappearance of 8-year-old Ethan Cole had moved beyond the small lakeside town and into the glare of statewide headlines. News crews set up along the main road leading into the campground, their satellite vans and bright lights creating an almost surreal backdrop to the unfolding grief. Reporters stood in front of the lake, speaking into cameras with practiced solemnity, repeating the same lines about a boy who had simply vanished, a search that had yielded nothing, and the gnawing mystery of whether he had drowned or been taken. The sheriff's office began receiving a flood of tips from across the region, each one treated with urgency, though the majority would lead to disappointment. One caller claimed to have seen a man walking along the shoulder of Highway 47 just hours after Ethan disappeared. The man was described as wearing a faded baseball cap and holding the hand of a small boy in a red life jacket. Patrol units canvassed the stretch of highway and pulled surveillance footage from nearby gas stations, but no image of the pair was ever found. Another tip described a suspicious white van parked near the campground service road on the day in question. It had no plates visible from the rear, and the witness thought they saw movement inside, but they hadn't stayed long enough to be sure. Investigators tracked down every registered owner of a similar vehicle in the county. All were accounted for, and none had been near the lake. The strangest tip came from a local fisherman who told deputies he had seen a small sneaker floating near the far shore in the early morning, 2 days after the disappearance. By the time a search team made it to the location, nothing remained. He couldn't describe the brand or size, only that it was light-colored and looked like a kid's. The lead, like so many others, evaporated into speculation. As the weeks passed, the Cole family found themselves drawn into the public eye in ways they had never anticipated. At first, they agreed to interviews and press conferences, hoping the exposure might reach someone who knew something. Linda would stand at the podium, clutching a printed photo of Ethan, her voice trembling as she pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. Paul stood beside her, stoic but visibly exhausted, his gaze fixed on the floor as cameras clicked in rapid bursts. But the more their faces appeared on the evening news, the more they became the subject of a different kind of attention, the kind that erodes trust and twists narratives. Whispers began circulating in town. At the grocery store, in the post office, and at the gas station, people exchanged theories in low voices. Some claimed the Coles were in debt and had staged something for insurance. Others hinted at marital problems, or that one of them had a temper. The speculation was fueled by the complete absence of physical evidence. Without something tangible to point to, the human tendency was to fill in the void with stories. Detectives were aware of the shift in public opinion, but their job was to follow leads, not manage gossip. Still, they couldn't ignore the strain it put on the investigation. Every tip that came in had to be weighed. Was it a genuine sighting or a neighbor settling a grudge? They began to notice that for every potential lead about a stranger or a vehicle, there were 2 or 3 that subtly, or not so subtly, pointed suspicion back toward the parents. Each required hours of background checks and interviews and cross-referencing, all of which pulled resources from the broader search for Ethan. Meanwhile, the investigation's physical evidence log remained alarmingly thin. No belongings had been found on land or in the water. No fingerprints, no fibers, no confirmed sightings past the moment Ethan was last seen on the dock. The timeline was painfully short, just minutes in which he had gone from a laughing child to someone no one could find. It left investigators with a list of possible scenarios, but no way to rule any of them out. For the Coles, the emotional toll was relentless. Linda stopped going to the grocery store alone after overhearing two women debating whether she looked guilty. Paul found himself staring at the front window late at night, scanning the quiet street outside their home as though expecting to see his son walking up the driveway. Their daughter, only 5 at the time of the disappearance, grew quieter with each passing week, retreating into a room to escape the reporters who sometimes parked on their street. The official investigation pressed on, but in private, some members of the sheriff's department began to acknowledge what the Coles had already sensed, that the case was drifting. The initial flood of leads had slowed to a trickle, and most were repeats of theories already examined and discarded. Without new information, momentum was fading. Still, Detective Laura Brenner kept the case file open on her desk, revisiting it between other assignments. She knew that somewhere, in the pile of dead ends and second-hand accounts, there could be a thread they had overlooked, but for now the reality was inescapable. The search had reached a standstill, and in the absence of answers, the truth was being drowned out by a tide of rumor and suspicion. And as summer began to fade into autumn, the lake remained exactly as it had been, quiet, unyielding, and unwilling to give anything back. As summer gave way to fall, and then to winter, the urgency that had once surrounded Ethan Cole's disappearance shifted into something quieter but no less heavy. The lake froze over, its surface a smooth, pale sheet, concealing the restless searching that had once churned beneath. By the time spring returned, the official search had long since been scaled back, but the Coles still came on weekends, standing at the shore in the same spot they had last seen their son. They stayed for hours, saying little, scanning the water as though the answers might finally break the surface. A year after Ethan vanished, nature itself seemed to conspire to expose its secrets. That summer brought an unusual drought, lowering the lake's level by several feet. Shorelines that had been underwater were now patches of cracked mud and tangled reeds. Old fishing lures, rusted beer cans, and even a rotting canoe emerged from the receding water, each discovery stirring brief flickers of hope among those who still followed the case. Search volunteers returned with metal detectors, some wading through knee-deep shallows, but the only things recovered were relics of long-forgotten summers. No clothing, no life jacket, no trace of Ethan. In August, the Cole family made the agonizing decision to hold a memorial service. It was not a funeral, no casket, no burial, but a gathering of friends, relatives, and neighbors under a white canopy near the church. Photos of Ethan were placed on easels, showing him in birthday hats, holding fishing poles and grinning with missing teeth. People spoke about his energy, his kindness, and the way he could make even strangers laugh. But when it came time for the closing prayer, no one could bring themselves to speak the word goodbye. For Linda and Paul, the service was not closure, but another reminder of the void that had taken over their lives. Meanwhile, in the sheriff's department, the case file was pulled from its storage shelf once again. Detective Laura Brenner and her colleagues spent weeks going over every report, every photograph, every diver's log. They considered drowning scenarios so rare they bordered on improbable. A body wedged into a narrow crevice, pinned beneath heavy debris, or tangled in underwater vegetation so dense it resisted even the diver's touch. They cross-referenced these ideas with the lake's known hazards, noting the drop-offs and deep holes mapped in the early search. In an effort to leave no possibility unexplored, they brought in a forensic hydrologist from the state university. He spent days studying the lake, releasing harmless dye into the water to track currents, measuring wind patterns, and calculating how objects would drift under various conditions. His conclusion was blunt and troubling. In every modeled scenario, if a body had entered the lake near the dock, it would have surfaced within 2 to 5 days, even accounting for entanglement or silt. The absence of a recovery after more than a year, he said, was statistically extraordinary. The report unsettled more than just the investigators. It challenged the comfort some had taken in believing the lake was the final answer, that the tragedy was a drowning, tragic, but explainable. Without that, the case drifted into more dangerous territory. If Ethan had not drowned, the only other explanation was that he had left the water's edge entirely. That meant someone could have taken him. Detectives began quietly shifting the focus of their investigation. They revisited old witness statements, this time reading them for signs of what might have been missed. They scrutinized the timeline again, looking for gaps or inconsistencies that could point to an abduction. The scent dog alert in the woods, dismissed months earlier as inconclusive, was reconsidered. Could it have been a true lead, cut short because the trail was interrupted by a vehicle? The theory gained weight in private discussions among the team. In an abduction, the lack of physical evidence made sense. A skilled offender could take a child in seconds, leave no trace, and be on the highway within minutes. And if the perpetrator had been someone familiar with the campground, someone who blended in with vacationing families, they could have moved without drawing attention. Still, there was no proof, only a growing sense that the answer wasn't in the water at all. For the Coles, that idea was both horrifying and strangely hopeful. If someone had taken Ethan, then there was a chance he was still alive. But hope was dangerous. It could carry them for months, only to drop them into a deeper grief when no answers came. As the second year began, the lake sat lower than anyone could remember, its muddy edges marked with the footprints of people still searching. It had revealed pieces of its past, but nothing of the day Ethan vanished. To many, it was becoming more than a body of water. It was a wall, one that held its silence while the truth, whatever it was, existed somewhere just beyond reach. And in the absence of that truth, the questions only grew sharper, pushing investigators further toward a conclusion that no one wanted to voice aloud. 6 years had passed since the day at the lake, but for the Coles, time had not moved forward in any way that mattered. They no longer lived in the same house where Ethan's laughter once filled the hallways. 2 years after his disappearance, the weight of the mortgage, coupled with the relentless strain on their marriage, pushed them into selling it. The smaller home they moved into felt less like a fresh start and more like a retreat from constant reminders: the empty bedroom, the growth chart on the kitchen wall that stopped abruptly at age 8, the neighbors who couldn't look at them without sympathy or suspicion. Paul buried himself in work, taking long shifts just to avoid being home, while Linda withdrew from friends, her social life shrinking until it barely existed. Ethan's younger sister, Lily, was now 14. She had been 5 when her brother vanished, young enough that her memories were already hazy, but old enough to feel the absence like a wound that never closed. She rarely spoke about him at all, not to her parents, not to her friends, not even to herself. It wasn't that she had forgotten. If anything, she remembered too well. But the silence in their family was easier to live with than reopening the endless questions no one could answer. Her parents noticed, but they didn't press. Every conversation about Ethan eventually ended in the same way, with grief and with no resolution. The official investigation had long since gone cold. The active search had been over for years, the case file relegated to storage along with dozens of other missing persons reports whose leads had dried up. But for Detective Laura Brenner, Ethan's disappearance was never just another case. She had been a mid-level investigator when it happened. Now, she was a veteran in the department's missing persons unit, hardened by experience but still unable to shake certain cases from her mind. Ethan's was at the top of that list. She kept the file in the bottom drawer of her desk, not in the archives where it belonged. A few times each year she would pull it out, flipping through the pages, the photographs, and the search logs. Sometimes she'd stay late, reading until the office was empty, looking for a detail she might have missed. She knew the statistics, that most child abduction cases that go unsolved in the first few weeks rarely resolve years later. But she also knew the lake had never given up a body, and that the forensic hydrologist's report still stood unchallenged. If Ethan had drowned, he should have been found within days. That fact alone was enough for her to keep believing there was another explanation, one that didn't end at the bottom of the lake. And if that was true, then somewhere, someone was alive who knew exactly what had happened to him. Over the years, Brenner had quietly rechecked some of the early leads. The man was seen walking along the highway with a child. The white van was reported near the campground. The fisherman's story about the floating sneaker. None had led to anything conclusive. but each still gnawed at her. She thought often about the dogs picking up Ethan's scent in the woods and losing it, a clue that had been sidelined early but never disproven. For the Coles, contact with law enforcement was minimal now. Occasionally, a deputy would call to inform them of a tip, but the leads almost always evaporated before they could begin to hope. They had learned to temper their expectations, to guard themselves against the roller coaster of sudden possibilities that ended in the same crushing emptiness. Holidays were the hardest. Each year, Linda would quietly set out Ethan's stocking, unable to bring herself to leave it packed away. Paul avoided the gesture entirely, staying busy with projects in the garage while the rest of the world celebrated. 6 years after that summer day, the lake had become a place they no longer visited. It wasn't fear of the water. It was the knowledge that standing there, looking out over its surface, would bring back the sound of his laughter, followed by the suffocating silence that had swallowed it. In their minds, that dock had become the edge of their lives as they knew them. Everything that came after was marked by its absence. Brenner, meanwhile, had developed a reputation in the department for her persistence, though some quietly called it obsession. She didn't care. She had seen too many cases where time was the only thing standing between mystery and truth. Files went cold, but people made mistakes. Witnesses came forward years later. A piece of evidence found in one investigation would suddenly make sense in the context of another. She believed that Ethan's case would eventually get that break, but only if someone was still looking when it came. And so, even with no fresh leads, no active investigation, and no new reason to think she would find anything, she kept the file close. She read it, she thought about it, and sometimes when she drove home from work, she found herself taking the long way, past roads and towns connected, however faintly, to that day. She couldn't explain it, but the feeling had never left her. The lake was a distraction, and the real story had happened somewhere else. All she needed was one person, one photograph, one moment where the past slipped into the present and revealed itself. Until then, the silence remained, but so did her conviction that Ethan Cole's story wasn't over. On a mild Saturday morning in early June, in a small Wisconsin town far from the Minnesota lake where Ethan Cole had vanished, the streets were lined with folding tables and cardboard boxes. It was the annual community yard sale, the kind of small-town ritual where neighbors browsed one another's cast-offs and bartered over quarters. The air smelt faintly of cut grass and coffee from a stand set up by the local church. Marjorie Hale moved slowly along the rows, scanning for things she could use in her crafts. She was drawn to objects with a history: lace scraps, mismatched china, old paper with yellowed edges. At the far end of a driveway, she noticed a weathered cardboard box filled with photo albums. The covers were frayed, the pages warped from years of handling. The man running the sale, an elderly widower, told her they had belonged to his late sister, who had lived in several states over the years. He was clearing out her attic. He offered the whole box for $5. That afternoon, Marjorie sat at her kitchen table with the albums spread out before her. She planned to remove the photographs, keeping the pages for scrapbooking. The first few albums were what she expected: family reunions, road trips, and snapshots of people she didn't know, smiling stiffly at the camera. But when she opened the third album and turned to the middle, her hands stilled. The photo was of a 4th of July picnic: lawn chairs clustered under a string of red, white, and blue flags, paper plates balanced on laps. Behind them, cars were parked under shade trees. Nothing about it was unusual, except for the boy at the center of the frame. He looked around to 12. His hair was longer than shoulder length, his cheeks fuller than she remembered from old images, but his eyes stopped her. They were the same pale green she had seen 100 times before, staring out from a missing poster that had once hung in her hometown. Her chest tightened. Marjorie had grown up one town over from where the Cole family lived and had been a teenager when Ethan disappeared. She remembered the day his face first appeared in the news, the photograph of him in a red life jacket, grinning. She remembered the prayer vigils and the endless searches. It had been assumed, at least publicly, that the lake had claimed him. Yet here, dated July 4, 2017, in neat handwriting, was a boy who looked exactly like Ethan Cole, 4 years after he had supposedly drowned. She told herself it could be a coincidence. People resembled each other, but the longer she looked, the harder it was to believe. The shape of his nose, the curve of his jaw, the way his smile lifted more on one side. They were identical. And then she saw it. On his right wrist, a thin, braided leather bracelet. She remembered reading an article that mentioned Ethan wearing one the day he vanished, a gift from his grandfather. Her pulse quickened. She turned the page and found more photographs. The boy sat cross-legged on the grass, petting a golden retriever. He stood at a kitchen counter, frosting a cake while a woman in her 50s stood beside him. In another, he pedaled a bicycle down a gravel driveway, a man's hand steadying the seat. The captions identified the adults as Gordon and Ellen, with no last name given. They appeared in most of the pictures with him, at fairs, birthday parties, and in front of a modest one-story home with pale siding. Marjorie sat back, staring at the stack of albums. The boy was older in these photos, clearly past the age of the 8-year-old who had disappeared, but the resemblance was undeniable. She didn't know who Gordon and Ellen were or why their photos ended up in this box. She only knew she was looking at something that might matter far beyond her small kitchen. She thought about keeping quiet, convincing herself it was none of her business, but the image of the missing poster wouldn't leave her mind. That night, she called the county sheriff's office. The dispatcher listened, asked her to hold, then transferred her to an investigator. She described the photographs, the boy, the bracelet, and the date written beneath the picnic picture. She agreed to bring the albums to the station first thing in the morning. When Detective Laura Brenner opened the album the next day, she felt a rush of certainty she hadn't experienced in years. She'd stared at Ethan Cole's photo for so long that she could pick him out of a crowd without hesitation. The resemblance wasn't a resemblance. It was him. The bracelet confirmed it. She turned the pages slowly, studying the adults in the photos, the backgrounds, and the handwritten captions. The couple, Gordon and Ellen, smiled in almost every picture, but their body language with the boy struck her as guarded, as if he were a guest, not a son. The detective noted landmarks in the backgrounds: a fairground entrance with a county name partially visible, a gas station sign across from a gravel road, and a school banner hanging from a chain-link fence. Each image was a breadcrumb. She had the albums logged as evidence, scanned in full, and began tracing the details. The name Gordon and Ellen was a starting point. Public records, vehicle registrations, and past addresses would follow. For Brenner, the moment was more than professional progress. It was vindication. For 6 years, she had resisted the drowning conclusion. She had believed that Ethan had been taken, not lost to the lake. Now, in her hands, was proof he'd been alive long after that day. Proof that the lake had not been the ending. Marjorie, meanwhile, returned to her quiet life, shaken by how close the photographs had come to disappearing into obscurity. If she hadn't bought that box, if she had tossed the albums straight into the recycling bin, the evidence might have been gone forever. That night, Brenner sat alone at her desk long after the station had gone quiet, the album open in front of her. She studied the boy's face in the 4th of July photo, the slight squint of his eyes against the sun. She thought about how easily his life had been rewritten, how a child could be erased from one family and placed into another, moving across state lines under a false identity. She didn't yet know where the couple was now, or if the boy in the photographs was still with them, but she knew one thing with absolute clarity. The past had just stepped into the present, and for the first time in years, the search for Ethan Cole was no longer about what might have happened. It was about where he was now, and who had been hiding him all along. When the call came in, Detective Laura Brenner wasn't expecting anything. Cold case tips about Ethan Cole still trickled in a few times a year, but most were long shots, blurred sightings, vague memories, second-hand rumors. She had learned to approach them with caution, to protect herself from the familiar cycle of hope and disappointment. But when the sheriff from a small county in Wisconsin said a woman had walked into their office with photographs of a boy who looked exactly like Ethan, her voice caught before she could answer. The sheriff mentioned something else, too, a detail she couldn't ignore. The boy in the picture was wearing a thin, braided leather bracelet. Brenner's grip tightened on the phone. That bracelet had been on Ethan's wrist the day he vanished, a gift from his grandfather, worn so constantly it was frayed in the missing posters. She made the 3-hour drive without stopping, replaying the few words the sheriff had shared. The woman's name was Marjorie Hale. She had bought the photo albums at a yard sale from a man clearing out his late sister's belongings, and somewhere inside those albums was an image dated 4 years after Ethan had been declared drowned. Or worse. When Brenner finally saw the photograph, she didn't need to study it for long. Her hands trembled as she turned the page. The boy's hair was longer, his cheeks older, but the eyes, those pale green eyes, were the same. It was Ethan. There was no mistaking the subtle tilt of his smile, the faint freckle on his jawline, or the way his right hand curled slightly when he wasn't holding anything. She had memorized those details from years of staring at his missing person file. And there, just above his wrist, was the bracelet. Marjorie's box contained more than a single image. Brenner flipped through and found the boy at a county fair, squinting against the sun while holding a paper cone of cotton candy. In another, he was seated at a table, leaning forward to blow out candles on a birthday cake, while a woman in her 50s stood behind him, hands on his shoulders. A third showed him riding a bicycle down a gravel driveway, a man's hand reaching in from the edge of the frame, steadying the seat. The boy was smiling in all of them, but Brenner noticed something else, a stiffness, a watchfulness in his posture. The adults appeared in almost every photo, a middle-aged couple with guarded expressions in plain clothing, the kind that could pass unnoticed anywhere. The captions beneath some of the images identified them simply as Gordon and Ellen. In a few, handwritten notes marked locations: a county fair in Iowa, a picnic in Missouri, a small-town parade in Illinois. Back at her desk, Brenner ran their names through databases. The results were frustratingly thin. Gordon and Ellen Pike, married in 1993, no children listed. Their addresses jumped across the Midwest every 1 to 2 years, sometimes within the same state, sometimes across state lines. The movements weren't random. They followed a pattern Brenner had seen before in certain foster and kinship care arrangements. The Pikes were registered foster carers in 2 states, but their licenses had expired years earlier. In applications, they'd claimed to have provided short-term care for relatives' children, though no official records confirmed these placements. Public records offered only fragments. Utility bills in different counties, short-term leases, and the purchase of an aging camper van later sold for cash. A speeding ticket issued in rural Nebraska, a vehicle registration in Kansas that lapsed without renewal. It was as if they had deliberately kept their footprint light, never staying long enough in one place to build connections. Brenner kept returning to one question: how had Ethan ended up with them? The lake, the dock, the conflicting witness accounts. If the Pikes were involved, they would have needed access to the area and a plausible reason to be near the campground. And they would have needed to take him without drawing attention in the crucial minutes between his last sighting and the chaos that followed. She called former neighbors tied to the addresses in the Pikes' history. Most remembered the couple vaguely, describing them as quiet, polite, and somewhat reclusive. A woman in Missouri recalled seeing them with a boy they called Michael, who appeared to be about 10 at the time. She remembered him helping Gordon carry groceries and occasionally playing in the yard, but never with other neighborhood kids. In Iowa, a man remembered the boy trying to ride his bike down the street before Ellen shouted at him to come back. He said the boy didn't look happy. The pattern was emerging, but it was fragile. The photos were the most compelling link. They placed Ethan alive and in the Pikes' care years after he'd been presumed gone. But without knowing where they were now or if he was still with them, it was a puzzle with too many missing pieces. That night, Brenner spread the photographs across her dining table. She studied every detail: the angle of the sunlight, the signage in the background, the license plates barely visible at the edges. Each clue could be a thread to follow. Somewhere in these images, she believed, was the path to Ethan's present. The thought was both electrifying and sobering. After 6 years, she finally had proof he hadn't drowned, but she also had the first real glimpse of the people who might have stolen him from the dock that summer afternoon. She closed the last album and sat back, the weight of the years pressing in. The case was no longer cold, not completely. But if the Pikes had managed to keep him hidden this long, finding him now would require moving quickly and quietly. And deep down, She knew that someone out there still knew exactly where Ethan Cole was. The challenge would be getting to him before that silence closed in again. Detectives began their search for Gordon and Ellen Pike the same way they approached any long-term missing persons lead, by reconstructing every place they had ever lived. It was a process built on fragments, old addresses from rental agreements, utility bills left unpaid, and vehicle registrations filed and later abandoned. Piece by piece, the trail began to take shape, stretching across 6 different counties in as many years after Ethan's disappearance. The pattern was deliberate. They never stayed anywhere for more than 18 months, often leaving just before a lease expired or after selling a vehicle for cash. Each move seemed designed to keep them from ever planting roots, the kind of transient lifestyle that made tracking them and anyone living with them almost impossible in real time. The photographs from the album became the cornerstone of the timeline. Investigators matched the dates scrawled beneath each image to the corresponding addresses. A 4th of July picnic in 2017 lined up with a rental property in rural Iowa. A birthday party photo from the following winter matched a small single-story house in Missouri. A fairground snapshot was traced to Kansas. Each location confirmed what Brenner had begun to suspect. The boy seen with the Pikes was being moved along with them, his surroundings changing as frequently as theirs. Neighbors from each stop filled in the gaps. In Iowa, a retired couple recalled a boy around 10 years old who was introduced to them as Michael, the Pikes' nephew. They said he seemed quiet but polite, always quick to say thank you, but he rarely played with other children. In Missouri, a woman remembered him riding a bike in the gravel driveway while Ellen watched from the porch. She noticed he never ventured far and once heard Gordon tell him to stay where we can see you. Then came a more disturbing account. In Kansas, a man living 2 doors down told detectives that one summer evening, he had seen the boy running barefoot down the street. He thought the kid might be playing until Gordon came into view, shouting and chasing after him. The man remembered Gordon grabbing the boy by the arm and pulling him back toward the house while the boy struggled. At the time, the neighbor had assumed it was a family argument. Now, with the context of the investigation, the memory took on an entirely different weight. Detectives worked to find anyone who might have had closer contact with the boy, teachers, doctors, social workers, but came up empty. School records were non-existent under the name Michael Pike, and there was no trace of him in official foster care databases. It was as if he had lived entirely off the grid, moving from one pocket of isolation to another. The Pikes' history with the foster system explained some of it. They knew how to navigate the gaps and how to avoid mandatory reporting by staying outside formal channels. As the picture of their movements grew clearer, so did a grim reality. Gordon and Ellen were no longer alive to question. Records showed they had both been killed in a single vehicle accident on a rural road in Nebraska the year before the photograph surfaced. Their pickup had gone off the shoulder at night, rolling into a ditch. Toxicology reports indicated neither had been under the influence. The cause was listed as driver fatigue. With them gone, any chance of directly confronting the people who might have taken Ethan vanished instantly. The news hit Brenner harder than she expected. For years, she had imagined what it would be like to finally sit across from someone who knew where Ethan had been all this time, to press them for details, to find the moment in their story where the truth cracked open. Now, that possibility was gone. The Pikes had taken their secrets with them, but the investigation couldn't stop there. Without the couple, the only viable lead left was the boy in the photographs. Somewhere between the Pikes' last known residence and the fatal accident, he had to have been left behind, placed with someone else, hidden under another name, or, in the worst scenario, vanished again. The challenge was finding out which. Detectives turned their focus to identifying every connection the Pikes had maintained during those years. Relatives, friends, landlords, even casual acquaintances. They combed through phone records and bank statements, though the accounts were minimal and the calls infrequent. Still, a few names surfaced, people who had rented to them, sold them a vehicle, or worked with them briefly in seasonal jobs. Each was contacted, questioned, and cross-referenced against locations where the boy might have been seen. In every conversation, Brenner listened for the smallest slip, someone referring to the kid or using a name that didn't match the official story. It was slow, grinding work, and the lack of immediate results was frustrating. But she knew this was often how the truth surfaced, not in a dramatic confession, but in a casual detail that seemed unimportant to the person speaking it. The more they dug, the more the trail narrowed to a window of time in the final year before the Pikes' deaths. Somewhere in that period, the boy's path would have crossed with someone new, someone who might still be keeping him, and if that person existed, Brenner was determined to find them. The photographs had confirmed that Ethan hadn't drowned in the lake 6 years earlier. They had proven he'd been alive, moving through small towns under another name. Now, with the Pikes gone, the urgency was sharper than ever. Every year he was hidden was another year of a stolen life, and the next move might determine whether Ethan Cole was finally brought home or whether his trail would disappear for good. The break came quietly, almost without ceremony, in the form of a call to the department's tip line from a woman in northern Michigan. She introduced herself as a former co-worker of Ellen Pike and said she had been debating for weeks whether to contact anyone. Years earlier, she had been invited to the Pikes' property for a weekend visit. They owned a small cabin tucked deep into the woods, and during that visit, she had met a boy they introduced as Michael, their nephew. She remembered him as polite but unusually quiet, speaking only when spoken to and keeping his eyes on the floor when adults addressed him. It hadn't seemed important at the time, but after seeing the news about the photographs found in the yard sale album, she couldn't shake the thought that the boy she had met might have been the same one in those pictures. Detective Laura Brenner and a small team made the trip north. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow gravel track nearly a mile from the main road, surrounded on all sides by dense pine and oak forest. It looked abandoned. The paint on the siding was peeling, the porch sagged in places, and weeds had overtaken what had once been a small yard. There was no sign of recent use, no tire tracks, no footprints in the dirt. While walking the property, Brenner noticed a structure partially hidden by overgrown grass behind the cabin. It was a small shed, weathered and gray, with a new heavy-duty padlock fixed to the door. The wood around the lock was darker, as if it had been replaced more recently than the rest of the building. The team forced the lock open, and when the door swung inward, a stale, dusty air escaped, carrying a faint scent of mildew and fabric that hadn't been disturbed in years. Inside, the space was barely 8 feet by 10, the walls bare except for a narrow shelf. A thin mattress sat directly on the wooden floor, its blanket neatly folded at the foot as though someone had once been instructed to keep it that way. A few feet away lay a small pile of toys, a scattering of matchbox cars, a scuffed baseball glove, and a stack of worn comic books. In the corner, a clear plastic bin contained children's clothing in sizes spanning several years. Taped to the wall above the shelf was an old flashlight, its battery compartment corroded with age. Near the baseboard, faintly scratched into the wood, were 2 letters, EC. Brenner moved carefully, noting every detail. The space didn't feel like simple storage. It felt arranged, inhabited, but hidden. The dimensions, the single high window, the heavy lock. It was a place meant to keep someone in or keep others out. The contents of the shed were bagged and cataloged. A forensic team collected swabs from the bedding, the clothing, and the toys. Days later, the lab results arrived. Ethan Cole's DNA was present on multiple items inside the shed. It was the first irrefutable physical proof in 6 years that he had been alive after the day he vanished from the lake. The discovery shifted the focus of the investigation. The shed wasn't just a forgotten outbuilding. It was evidence of where Ethan had been kept, at least for part of the time he was missing. Investigators began to dig deeper into the Pikes' background, looking for a larger pattern that could explain what had happened. Interviews with former neighbors, landlords, and social workers painted a disturbing picture. The Pikes had a long history of taking in children from unstable family situations. In some cases, parents in crisis had informally left children with them for what was supposed to be a short time. In others, they claimed kinship ties to avoid the oversight that came with licensed foster placements. They knew the system well enough to slip between its cracks, moving before anyone could follow up. One retired social worker recalled them vividly. They often claimed that the children in their care were relatives, but no documentation ever backed up the relationships. Their addresses changed so frequently that keeping track was nearly impossible. When a child disappeared from their household, there was rarely an official record of where they had gone. There were no adoptions, no transfers to other licensed homes, just silence. The working theory began to take shape. On the day Ethan disappeared, the Pikes may have been at the campground or near the lake for reasons still unknown. They would have seen him playing alone, running between the dock and the picnic area. The lure, investigators believed, was simple and believable: help finding a missing dog. Witness accounts of seeing him near the wooded trail, combined with the scent dog's brief pickup of a trail in that area, suddenly made sense. From there, he could have been led to a waiting vehicle parked beyond public view. Within minutes, he was gone, the search at the lake doomed to fail before it began. From that moment, Ethan would have been absorbed into the Pikes' itinerant life. They gave him a new name, Michael, and moved him from one rural rental to another, keeping him out of school and away from situations where someone might recognize him. The shed in Michigan may have been used during one of their relocations, a temporary space to keep him out of sight when visitors came, or when they needed to leave him alone for long stretches. For Brenner, the discovery of the shed was more than a breakthrough. It was a confirmation of everything she had believed for years. Ethan hadn't drowned. He hadn't vanished into the lake's depths. He had been taken, and for 6 years, while his family mourned and the public assumed the water had claimed him, he had been hidden in plain sight, passed off as someone else entirely. But with the Pikes dead, the shed raised new, urgent questions. Where had Ethan gone after they left Michigan? Who had been with him in the final months before their fatal accident? Somewhere in that answer was the key to finding him now. The property was processed and cleared. The shed was sealed after evidence was removed. Yet Brenner couldn't shake the image of the small bare room, the mattress, and the initials in the wood. It was proof of a stolen childhood, compressed into 8 by 10 feet. It was also the most concrete sign yet that he had been within reach, hidden behind locked doors in a quiet stretch of forest, while the world searched in the wrong places. If someone had sheltered him after the Pikes' deaths, that person might still have him, and if they did, every day that passed made it less likely he would return on his own. The shed had given them proof Ethan lived past that day at the lake. Now, the investigation would turn to finding the last person to see him and making sure that silence didn't bury him a second time. The final lead came from a small town in northern Michigan, less than an hour from the wooded property where the shed had been found. A foster agency worker, reviewing a list of placements from the year after the Pikes' deaths, noticed a teenage boy whose records were unusually thin. He had been brought in by a family friend who claimed the boy's parents had died and that there were no living relatives. His birth certificate was a recent reissue from another state, and the name on it, Michael Pike, was the same alias investigators knew had been used for Ethan. Detectives arrived quietly, coordinating with the foster home's case manager. They found him outside, sitting on the back steps with a book. He was tall now, the baby-faced boy from the photographs replaced by a lanky teenager. But when Brenner saw him, she recognized him instantly. It wasn't just the shape of his jaw or the faint freckle on his cheek. It was the eyes, pale green, the same as in every photo she had studied for 6 years. She didn't tell him who she was right away. They followed procedure, confirming his identity through DNA taken from a discarded water bottle, the match returning at nearly 100%. Ethan Cole, missing since the age of 8, had been found alive at 14. The reunion with his family was arranged with care, but nothing could prepare them for what it would feel like. When Ethan stepped into the room where his parents and sister were waiting, the air seemed to hold still. Linda stood first, tears welling instantly, while Paul gripped the arm of the chair as though bracing himself. Lily, now a teenager herself, lingered behind them, unsure whether to move forward. Ethan's expression was cautious, almost shy. He hugged them when they reached for him, but the embrace was stiff at first, his body tense under their arms. In the hours that followed, Ethan spoke in fragments. He remembered the lake, the dock, running along the shoreline. He remembered a woman's voice calling to him, promising to show him a lost dog. He remembered walking up the trail, away from the water, and climbing into a vehicle. After that, the memories blurred. There were houses, but they changed often. a constant sense of being told where to stand, when to speak, and when to stay inside. Gordon and Ellen were strict, rarely letting him outside without one of them close by. He didn't attend school, instead learning from workbooks at a kitchen table. Birthdays were quiet affairs, cake in the living room, no guests. He said he had been told his real family didn't want him, that he was better off where he was. Over time, the memory of his parents' faces had faded. He had stopped asking questions because the answers never changed. Even when they moved to Michigan, where the shed sat behind the cabin, he accepted the small room as just another part of life. He slept there when visitors came or when the couple went out. He didn't know why. Brenner listened to his account with the same measured calm she had carried through the investigation, but inside she felt the sharp edge of anger. The details confirmed what the evidence had already suggested. Ethan's disappearance hadn't been an accident, and it hadn't been the lake. It had been calculated, sustained, and hidden behind the ordinary masks of a couple who knew exactly how to stay unnoticed. For the Coles, having him back was both a relief and a challenge. 6 years apart had created a gap they didn't know how to close in a single meeting. Ethan was polite, even affectionate in small ways. But there was a guardedness in him, a wariness that came from years of control. They understood they would have to rebuild their relationship slowly, letting him set the pace. The official closure of the case brought a muted satisfaction. Reports were filed, evidence cataloged, and the photographs that had set the final chain of events in motion were secured in the case archive. In the official summary, it was noted that Ethan had been located alive, reunited with his biological family, and was now under their care. But those words on paper could never capture the complexity of what had been lost, the birthdays missed, the friends never made, the ordinary years of childhood that had been replaced by confinement and secrecy. In the months that followed, Brenner visited the Coles once at their invitation. Ethan was quieter than she remembered from their first meeting, but he stayed in the room, listening as his parents talked about plans for counseling, school, and what came next. On a table in the living room, a single photograph sat in a frame, the one from the yard sale album, the 4th of July picnic. In it, Ethan was smiling faintly, his wrist turned just enough to show the braided leather bracelet. That picture had been the turning point. Without it, without Marjorie Hale recognizing his face, the trail might never have been reopened. Without it, the lake's silence might have remained unbroken, its dark reputation shielding the truth. Now, it stood as proof that he hadn't been lost to the water at all, but to something quieter, more deliberate, a long, stolen childhood hidden in plain sight. And though the case was closed, its weight would remain with everyone who had touched it, a reminder of how a single photograph in a stranger's hands had been enough to bring a boy home.